Welcome everybody, I'm John Wally, and today we're going to be going into episode 4 of Tenable OT Security. We're going to be focused on the installation and deployment of our sensors out in the field. We're going to talk about how to connect those back to the core appliance and how to go into the back end and make sure that we're getting all the data that we expect to be getting, testing out spans, testing our network information, and if you're deploying on ESXi, which we've been doing throughout this series, how we can actually make sure that the right ports are assigned to the right areas for that sensor. So why don't we jump in? So let's start with the hardware that we're looking at, much like we did with our Tenable OT Core appliance. So if I go over to docs.tenable.com, which we saw that before, I'm going to talk a little bit about the sensor configuration. So if you're rolling out and it's a hardware sensor, you're going to notice that there are 5 ports on that sensor. Now, something happened funny with Tenable. I'm going to explain a little bit about the mapping on these before we get into the virtual side. One of the things that you'll see is these ports are numbered. There's 5 total Ethernet ports on a sensor, and they go 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So they go back and forth where they're from the top of the sensor, they're in order. Now, one of the problems with this is that I don't know if it happened in labeling. So these numbers are not accurate on the front of that device. And I know that sounds crazy, but that is actually true. So the way that these are actually numbered is port 1 is port 1. So that would be NIC 0. And then port 3 is NIC 1, which is really the second interface. So the way that the board reads these is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so it causes some confusion when you're plugging things in, because if you're going on a physical appliance, you're going to plug in port 1 as your primary interface and port 3 as the monitoring port where you're picking up your PCAP data. And that may be a little bit confusing, but it has to do with how that front plate was labeled. It's not actually how the device is created. So if you go to the instructions, it'll tell you that you pick up on port 1 and port 3, but it may be misleading because every other device that's rolled out from Tenable actually goes port 1 and port 2. So it's just take note of that whenever you're installing on hardware, that it's port 1 is your primary port and port 3 is your monitoring port. Now there's some other things you can do in there where you can monitor on multiple ports. We're not going to get into that. That's more advanced. We'll do that much later in our series. But for now, just know that port 1 and port 3 are your primary physical ports that we'll be working with. So when we go into the videos for ESXi, you're going to see us talking about port 1 and port 2 because that mapping is still the same. But really, if you're talking about a physical device, it's 1 and 3, even though those configurations are on NIC 0 and NIC 1. I know that sounds really confusing. When we get into this, it'll make a lot more sense. I just wanted you to see the configurable sensor and how it's deployed and what the physical device looks like. And take note that there's actually 5 Ethernet ports on here, and this is going to matter for when we're setting up the device. The second thing we want to do is actually download our files. So much like we did before, I'm going to download the ISO version, but you could also go through and download the OVA for this. I know I said in the previous episode that we don't want to do that for the core appliance, but for your sensor, OVA images are fine. We're not going to play with them much. We're going to stay with the default minimums. There's no data stored on the sensor. It really is a capture and forward. So those specs aren't as important as far as what do we maintain. So let's go over to downloads.tenable.com, and we're going to go into, and I'm going to hit back here just so you can see this. I'm going to go into Tenable Core the same way we did before. And then I'm going to go down and I'm going to select, instead of Tenable Core, Tenable OT, I'm going to select Tenable Core, Tenable OT Sensor. And you'll see there's much the same way. You have an OVA, you have the offline ISO, and you have the regular ISO where you'll have to do downloads. I recommend doing the offline ISO. All right, so let's jump over to our ESXi lab, and we're going to start our setup. First, I'm going to go to storage, and we're going to make sure that we upload that file. So we've downloaded from the downloads. We got all that there. We're going to go to our labs. We're going to go to storage, and we're going to go to our browser and we're going to upload our ISO file. Now I've already done this for our episode here just to make sure that we're all prepped and ready to go. You'll notice that I may be on a different version from you as Tenable continues to release things. They typically release about every quarter. You don't have to worry about this. It's done the same way no matter what the version is. All right, so we're going to upload. If you need to, you can pause the video. I know there's a lot of download and upload you may be doing. That's fine. We'll take a few minutes here and then we'll jump into deploying our virtual machine. So I'm going to go to virtual machine. I'm going to say create new. I'm going to hit next. I'm going to call this Tenable OT Sensor. And then the same thing that we did before, this is Linux. And then we're going to say it's on Oracle Linux 8. All right. We're going to hit next. We'll put that on our data store. We'll hit next again. And then we have some basic settings here. Now, if I go back to downloads, I can see what the minimums are. So it says 2 CPUs, 4 gigs of memory, and a 60 gig hard drive. That's perfectly fine for this. We don't need to deviate in any way from these minimal settings. Pretty much the sensor, all it does is pass the data forward for us. So we should be good there. So we're going to say 2. We're going to change this to gig, and we're going to say 4 gigs of memory. And then the hard disk, we're going to say we need 60 gigs of storage. And just to verify that I have that right, so we have 2, 4, and 60. Excellent. 2, 4, and 60. All right. Then what we're going to do is we're going to add 4 network adapters. 1, 2, 3, 4. And so now you'll see that we have each one of these. We're going to keep all of these connected as before. We will come back and modify these after we get everything booted up and we have our MAC addresses all lined out so that we know which one is which when we start connecting to those networks. All right. We're going to go to our drive. We're going to go down to our data store, ISO drives, and we're going to grab the sensor image that we selected before. And go to select. And we should be good to go. I'm going to hit next here, and then we're going to click finish, and we're good. Everything is there. Now you always want to make sure that whenever you're uploading your ISOs that that's completely finished before you go build your VM. All right, I'm going to click on VM, and then we can start. In the same way before, when we talked about this, your graphical install is going to be your first one. If you're connected through a console cable on hardware, then you want to select your TTY S0. All right, we should be fully installed. We should have rebooted twice. If we waited for about 2 minutes afterwards, you'll see that there was some more services starting and stopping. And at the very end, I know it ended with this failed message that you see on the screen. That's perfectly all right. That's just because we haven't set up our DNS and all the ways to get out to check on our update services. So at this point, we are good to go and ready to start with our wizard. So just like before, we're going to log in with the username wizard, all lowercase, and then the password is admin. It's going to ask us if we want to set up a static address, and we're going to say yes. We're going to go to NIC 0. We'll pay attention to that MAC address of 316B. We're going to change this to manual. We're going to say show, and then we're going to add an address. For me, I'm going to do it on my local area network. And make sure that I put my CIDR notation in there. I'm going to go to my gateway, my DNS, And then I'm going to add a secondary DNS as well. I'm going to tab through until I get to OK. I'm going to go down to quit. And then it's going to ask me if I want to create an administrator account. I'm going to say yes. Create the user admin. I'm going to give it a password. It has to be 14 characters, uppercase, lowercase, number, and special character. All right, so we're good to go. Now I'm going to log in and check and make sure that my new admin and password work. And it looks like it does. The next thing I'm going to do is check out my interfaces and find out exactly how things are mapped. So I'm going to do IP, ADDR. And you'll see that NIC0 still has that 316B MAC address. I'm going to go to Actions, Edit. I'm going to look at my network cards, 316B. So we know this is our network adapter 1, so it connected in order. That's good. Then the second thing we want to look at is what is NIC 1. So it looks like NIC 1 is on 3175. I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to go to Edit, go to our network adapter 2. We're on 3175. On this adapter, I'm going to switch this to my monitoring port. So we're good to go there. The next thing I'm going to do is these other three, I'm going to disconnect. I don't need those right now. I may need them in the future, but for now they don't need to be connected, and I'm going to hit save. Excellent. Now the next thing I want to do, I know I'm up and running. I know that I have a good IP address here, so I'm going to close this window out. I'm going to open up a new tab in my browser, and I'm going to go to the address of 10.2.9.202. Port 8000. Now on the sensors, when you deploy those, that's the only interface you have. You're not going to have a 443 interface like you do on the core appliance. So all of our work is going to be done under port 8000. I'm going to go to advanced. I'm going to proceed. And I'm going to log in with the account that I created of admin. I'm going to enter my password. Excellent. So now that I am logged in, I'm good. I know we have a couple of failed services, and that's because our DNS wasn't set up. I'm going to turn on administrative access. I'm going to authenticate. And now we should be good to make any changes that we need to. First thing we're going to do is go into networking. We'll see that we have NIC 0 and NIC 1 are both up and receiving data. You'll see that NIC 0, if we click here, our DNS is set up. So that's good. We just want to verify that information. In our overview, we want to go change our host name. So I'm going to call this Tenable OT Sensor. And we're going to hit change. So we're good there. And then we'll go up to the sensor area, and it should be giving us an ability to connect back. I'm going to put this on hold now. I'm going to go back to our overview, and we're going to reboot the sensor. That way we make sure that everything goes into effect with host names, our DNS, everything is good before we start moving forward. I'm going to click reboot. I'm going to say no delay. I'm going to tell it to reboot now. While we're waiting on this to reboot, one of the ways that we work on getting the connection back from the sensor up through our network and into OT security is over a couple of key ports. Now those ports are 443 and 28303 or 28304. We're going to talk a little bit about why the different ports that are out there and what they do and how they function. So let's see if our system's back up. It looks like we are. We're going to log in as admin. And you'll see now all those errors are gone that we had before. And that's one of the reasons we want to reboot in between, to make sure that it picks up our new DNS stuff. It tries to reconnect. We have our host name set. And so then it's like clean when we start operating from a place of connecting up to the core appliance. Now, if you remember our core appliance, our IP address, the last octets were 201. And so we're going to have to connect up to those. So if you have a firewall in between, it's something to know that you're going to have to make sure that 443, 28303, 28304 are open. And I'm going to talk about where those are used in different places. All right. So if we go to our pairing, you don't want to, you want to use a true IP address here. You can try using the domain name or the host name. I've seen some problems with that in the past, depending on if you're running an Active Directory, how deep the forest is, how your DNS works, all those sort of things. It could be problematic. I recommend using the actual IP address. So I'm going to put in here 10.2.9.201. And then you'll notice some language here. It says ICP, and this is probably a new term that you haven't heard before. So an ICP is the core appliance. You're like, well, why do you call it an ICP if it's a Tenable core appliance? Or our Tenable OT Security core or appliance, kind of like, there's a bunch of different language. Either it's Tenable OT Core, Tenable OT Core appliance, there's all this different language. And so what Tenable's done is left some legacy naming in here so there's no confusion. So ICP stands for Invaluable Core Platform. And I know it's like, well, what in the world is Invaluable? So Tenable years ago, like yes, it's been almost 4 years ago, bought a company named Invaluable. And that's what Tenable OT is today, is it's grown on top of that Invaluable platform. And so there's still some back-end language that ties back to Invaluable. You're going to see an Invaluable user. You'll see an Invaluable folder that's out there, and you'll see things like this ICP. Yeah, the ICP is Invaluable Core Platform. So what that means is you're going back to that core appliance. Now you have a couple of options here. We could put in a user and a password, or we could use an API secret. And then we have this unauthenticated pairing, or if we don't check this, it would be authenticated pairing between the two. So let's talk a little bit about what the difference is between these options. So first and foremost, I'm going to start at the bottom and kind of work our way up. Unauthenticated. So unauthenticated turns the device into 100% passive. It can't do anything active on the network, and it basically captures data off of that NIC1, off of your monitoring port, and forwards it to the core appliance. That's the only thing it does. It doesn't do it over encrypted channel, but it does compress the data before it sends it on, about 4-to-1. So it does this compression, forwards the data up to the core appliance, and drops it off. So there's no tunnel in place. There's nothing like that other than some, like I said, some slight compression and moving it forward. If I use authenticated pairing, it truly creates a tunnel. So it creates a tunnel from point A to point B. That tunnel is established with a certificate exchange that happens over 443. And after that certificate's exchanged, it creates a tunnel on 28304, on port 28304. And that's why you hear the 3 port numbers is 443, 28303, and then 28304. And you can go out to the documentation and you'll see some of that port stuff if you go under and look at firewall pieces that are here. So if I go to firewall configurations, and what you'll see is 443 and 28304 is right here for the sensor. And you'll see it here again, 28303, if it's not for unauthenticated, or 28304 if it is authenticated. So you'll see the breakdown between the two. All right. So the next thing we need to do is we're setting this up is we need to figure out if we go authenticated and not unauthenticated, do we want the sensor to log in as a user and password, or do we want to log in through API? Now, I typically recommend doing this through API, setting it for a year, and then you refresh that key every year when you go and check on your sensors anyway. So let's go over to Tenable OT Security. So I know I had this already running. This is the same instance that we had before. So it's going to be OT admin. And we'll log in. Now, if we go down to our local settings, we will see sensors. And you'll see we don't have any sensors today. So we don't have anything out there where we're actually driving anything forward. So we're not getting good data. All the inventory that we have right now is really off of port 1, and it's stuff that we're seeing. We're not really sniffing for anything. I'm going to go down and look at some of the configuration settings that we have here. So we have a way of setting up devices here, and this is like our device stuff, like what is our device name, what is our system time, or that sort of stuff. We have port configuration that we saw before, where we have our queries and our mirror ports, and we could also edit it to open up a couple more here. We have a place where we get updates. We can update any certificates we have. Right now they're self-signed, but if you wanted to use an internal or a signed certificate, that you could upload and change this here. We have our license where we can update our licensing, and we have API keys. So what I recommend doing is going in and creating an API key for our sensors to connect. Now there's another way of doing this. I can go into manager or users management. I can go into local users, and I could always add a user for sensors. So I could go in, I could name this OT sensor, give it a password, and do it that way. I'm not going to do it this way. You can connect this way as well. You just need to make sure that that sensor is in the administrator's group so that it's able to write data back to the system. And this is one of the reasons that I don't like using this. All right. So I'm going to go back up where we're going to create an API key. I'm going to go generate the key. I'm going to make it good for 365 for the whole year. And I'm going to say this is for OT sensor connections. All right. I'm going to say generate. Now here's the key thing. You're not too worried about the ID, but you do need this secret API key. So we're going to copy this to our clipboard. I'm going to say done. We're going to go over to our sensor. I'm going to paste this in, and then we're going to pair with the sensor. And you'll notice that a few things happened here. You're going to get that there's a certificate mismatch. You'll see a couple of other errors in there. Just stay patient. It's just because it's establishing the connection back and forth. So now, where you'll end up is with this pending certificate approval. If you go down below here, you're going to see approval status, pending user approval. I can approve the certificate that came from the other system. So I'm going to click approve. I'm going to say approve the certificate. This will start updating again. It'll try to repair. It'll connect with a tunnel error, but this will come back up. So just be patient. Don't worry about the errors back and forth. That's just part of the negotiation process. If it stays more than that, like 2 or 3 minutes, depending on how fast your network is, then maybe be concerned. But in general, you should be good. So now you'll see we have this state of connected. We are done. There's other areas we can play with that I'll talk about a little bit here, but we'll get into this in more detail when we get into the advanced portions of this series. When we go to networking, let's say that I want to set up multiple areas where I want to drive really where I'm listening. And so what you'll see is I have NIC 1, NIC 2, NIC 3, NIC 4. One of the things I can do is bond those ports together and change what interface I'm listening on. So let's say that I want to connect 2 or 3 switches or 2 or 3 ports because I have a tap, and so I need more interfaces. It's one of the reasons the sensors have so many ports is if I have a tap, I'm going to tap up to 4 additional lines coming into that switch. Then I can do it this way, bond those ports together by saying add bond. I can say what interfaces do I want to bond. In this case, I could say all the way from 1 to 4, and then I can go in to my OT sensor and change. Once I have a bond in there, where do I want to monitor? I can tell it to monitor on bond 0. And so it'll pick up all of those ports on a single bonded port. We'll play with that a little bit in the future, but I wanted you to know that you had that capability to do that. You also have some capabilities to put in NAT rules and that sort of stuff if you're sitting on the other side of a firewall. All right, so let's go back over to OT security. So now what you should see is when we go under sensors, we have a connected sensor. But we're not quite done yet. So we know we have a sensor. We see that there's some information coming in here, but it says that active queries are disabled. It says that we're getting updates. And so one of the things that I want to draw your attention to is anytime our core appliance is updated, anytime Tenable OT security is updated, it will automatically check to see if we can push any updates out to the sensor. And so anytime that you update this, it will automatically push those those updates to sensors, and then there's no additional maintenance that's needed on those. So that if they're out in remote locations, you don't have to go out there, you don't have to load code, you don't have to push them. Tenable OT Security Core Appliance manages the updates to all of those sensors. But there's another piece that we're going to talk about when we get into how does the back end of Tenable OT work. And you'll notice this area for active queries. For active queries, one of the things we can do is we can say, hey, we want to edit the way this works. So I'm going to name this sensor. This is this connection. It's going to be, you could name this by a location. And then I'm going to say we're allowed to see the 10.2.9.0 network. So this is what I'm saying is able to active query. Now you may only want to put one IP address, or you may want to put 10 IP addresses, but not the whole subnet. You can even add multiple subnets. And then we're going to say that the sensor is allowed to do active queries. I'm going to hit save. You'll see now that active queries are enabled. It'll tell you what networks it's enabled for. It'll come up with the name of that device, and it'll tell you what version it's on. So you'll see there's already an updated version from what we loaded. All right, so that concludes our session for today. In our next episode, we're going to start talking about how do we load some data that we can truly use in a lab environment. Now, the next episode will only be for testing purposes and lab purposes, but it'll give us a better understanding of inventory. If you don't want to know how to do that and you're in a live environment, you'll be able to skip the next episode, and then we'll get into some of the fine tuning after that. So everybody have a great day. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. I watch them every day. And otherwise, have a great afternoon, and we'll talk to you next time.